Hey everyone, tonight we'll delve into the bizarre rituals and untold truths behind one of history's greatest deceptions, the Trojan Horse. You stand with me now on the windswept plains of ancient Troy, the air thick with the scent of salt and the memory of a decade-long siege. Imagine the silence, not the silence of peace, but the quiet that follows a great and terrible storm. The Achaean ships are gone, their sails vanishing on the horizon like a fleeting thought. The beach is empty, save for one monstrous, perplexing thing. A colossal wooden horse, its great flanks carved from pine and cypress, stands as a silent sentinel. The very air around it feels charged, not with wood and rope, but with something older, something you probably won't want to believe what you are about to hear. The truth is, the horse was never just a vessel of war. It was an altar for a strange, forgotten ceremony. So, before the tension gets too high, take a moment to like the episode and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, tell me where you are and what time it is for you. Now close your eyes, imagine the ancient mountains, and let's unravel this epic tale together. The story you know is a lie, or at least a beautiful half-truth. The Trojan War was not just a conflict of mortals. It was a bizarre ritual of deities, a chess match where the pieces were heroes and the board was the earth. For centuries, the gods had been locked in a cosmic stalemate. The war itself was a negotiation, a brutal, decade-long argument between deities like Athena, Apollo, and Poseidon over a prophecy lost to time. One of the most bizarre Greek mythology facts is the concept of divine contracts. These weren't just whims. They were binding agreements sealed with a strange kind of cosmic energy. And before the war even began, a terrible pact was made. A lesser-known deity, the goddess of entropy, named Eris, had placed an orb of discord at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, the one that famously led to the judgment of Paris. But that's not the whole story. The orb itself was a vessel for a bizarre oral curse. It was a fragment of a forgotten primordial entity, and its presence subtly nudged the gods toward conflict. The pact was this: the war would only end when one side performed a ritual so psychologically devastating it would break the very will of the enemy, not just their bodies. The Achaeans, with their relentless heroes and insatiable drive, were chosen for this grim task. But the question that remained was, what kind of ritual could shatter the soul of an entire city? The answer, as the epic unfolds, was not a sword or a spear, but a beautiful, terrifying stillness. The very construction of the horse was a sacred, almost meditative process. Appius, the master craftsman, was a mortal whose hands were guided by a god's will. A psychological compulsion he couldn't resist. His hammerfalls were not his own. They were dictated by the bizarre hum emanating from a sacred blueprint he'd found or been given at the start of the war. There is an old legend from the Aegean Islands that says some artisans were not just masters of their craft, but were vessels for their deity's desires. They would enter a trance-like state, their bodies moving with an unearthly precision, creating things of both profound beauty and terrible purpose. The Trojan horse was one such creation. It was more than wood. It was an artifact imbued with a kind of psychological resonance, a silent, terrible hymn to deception. It was a physical manifestation of a psychological weapon, a grand offering meant to soothe the Trojans' weary minds and lull them into a false sense of security. The bizarre hum that guided Epeius's hands did not originate from this world. It was a whisper from the sacred grove of Apollo, a place the Trojan priests frequented for divine guidance. But in this grove, something was amiss. The oracle, a priestess named Corinna, had been chosen by the god of prophecy himself. She was known for her visions that would manifest as swirling mists and fleeting shadows. But the prophecy she received now was different. It was not from Apollo. It was a fragmented, chilling message from a minor deity of lost things and forgotten dreams, a goddess whose name has been deliberately erased from the historical record. Corinna saw the Achaean ships sailing away, but she also saw a deep-rooted psychological trap. She saw a hollow horse, not filled with men, but with a formless terror that would prey on the citizens' minds. The message came not in words, but in a series of dissonant oral visions. She heard the sound of 1,000 tiny, ticking clocks, the creak of unseen ropes. and the rustling of dry leaves, all sounds that should not exist in the same moment. It was a cacophony of contradictions. A strange fact about ancient Greek beliefs is the concept of cytherisma, a word for a whispering that comes from no discernible source, believed to be the voice of spirits or, in rare cases, a mischievous deity. Corinna heard a cytherisma that promised peace if the Trojans would just open their gates to the gift. She saw the Trojans doing just that, not because of a logical decision, but because they were hypnotized by an invisible psychological force field radiating from the horse itself. This subtle, unseeable compulsion was the real weapon. The horse was just the delivery system. The heroes inside were merely the blade at the end of a long, invisible chain. This vision was not a simple warning. It was a psychological insight. The goddess was showing her that the Trojan people were not just suffering from a physical siege, but from a spiritual and mental exhaustion. They were weary of bloodshed, tired of the clang of swords and the constant vigil. The siege had been a decade of psychological warfare, and the horse was the final devastating blow. It was designed to exploit their deepest desire for an end to the conflict, to appeal to their most desperate hopes. Corinna saw the hollow horse, and she saw the Trojans' will being siphoned away, their collective hope transforming into a collective delusion. But who would believe a prophecy from a minor deity of lost things? And what hope did she have of convincing her people when she herself was an outcast? The priestess in her trance saw a specific, bizarre detail of this unknown deity. The goddess was not a figure of great power, but of strange, intricate artistry. Her symbol was not a thunderbolt or a trident, but a single, perfectly woven spider's web, which he spun between the threads of human thought. Her purpose was not to destroy or to create, but to weave intricate psychological traps, to create illusions that were more powerful than any physical reality. The spider's web was the prophecy, intricate and delicate, but binding and impossible to escape once you walked into it. The cytherisma was the spider's call. She saw that the horse was not a simple structure, but a sacred web woven to ensnare the Trojans' minds, to trick them into believing that their long nightmare was over. Corinna emerged from her trance, her eyes wide with a terror that surpassed any she had ever known. She tried to warn her fellow priests, to tell them that the horse was not a gift from the gods, but a psychological prison, an epic mystery waiting to unfold. But her words fell on deaf ears. They saw a tired, frail woman talking nonsense. They were already under the spell, hypnotized by the sudden peace and the strange magnetic presence of the colossal horse. The question that remained was, how could a single person break a spell cast on an entire city? And what would be the price for trying? The master craftsman Epius was a man of quiet hands and an obsessive mind. He had not sought this project, yet it had consumed him. When the war began, he was just a simple carpenter, but the gods had seen his potential. They had chosen him as their vessel, not for his strength, but for his deep-seated desire for recognition, his ambition. A fascinating fact from Norse legends, often mirroring Greek myths, is the idea of a craftsman being possessed by a specific spirit of creation, a kind of artistic demon. This demon, a seether, would guide their hands to create things of great power, but at the cost of their sanity. Pius felt a similar divine possession. He had not slept properly in months. His dreams were not his own. They were filled with visions of hollow spaces and intricate joinery. He saw the horse in every waking moment, its proportions, its sinews, its strange hollow core. The work was a ritual, a form of spiritual flagellation. For every piece of cypress and pine he carved, he felt a part of his own soul being hollowed out. A bizarre detail. Apius was a man who hated violence, a quiet artisan who found solace in the simple beauty of wood. Yet he was compelled to build a machine of war, a beautiful monstrosity. He spent his days in a trance-like state, carving and shaping, his hands moving with a speed and precision that was not his own. The other Achaean soldiers would watch him from a distance, mesmerized and a little frightened. He seemed to be more a part of the horse than a man building it. He would whisper to the wood strange incantations that no one understood. Some thought he was going mad, but the truth was more complex. He was not mad. He was a living extension of a deity's psychological will. The horse was a work of psychological art. The wood was carefully selected, not for its strength, but for its oral properties. When the wind blew, the horse did not creak like a normal ship's hull. It sang. It produced a low, haunting hum that carried on the wind and seemed to penetrate the very hearts of those who heard it. This was the first of the bizarre rituals, the sound of the horse. The hum was a kind of psychological resonance, designed to create a sense of unease and curiosity in the Trojans. It was a siren's call, not of beauty, but of a strange alien peace. It was a promise of a final quiet end to the long, bloody conflict. The horse was not just a symbol of surrender. It was a beacon of false hope, an illusion of peace so powerful it was physically disarming. Eupius worked tirelessly, his face a mask of weary determination. He felt a deep-seated revulsion for what he was creating, but he could not stop. He was a prisoner of his own divine obsession. He would often drop his tools, look at the monstrous creation, and weep silently. But then the bizarre hum would return, a gentle, insistent vibration in his mind. And he would pick up his tools again, his hands moving with an unholy precision. The horse was his masterpiece, but it was also his prison. He was building his own psychological cage, a hollow horse for his soul. But what would happen to the artisan when the masterpiece was completed? And what price would he pay for his divine possession? The question that remained was, did Eupius know the true purpose of the horse? Or was he just a pawn in a far more epic game, a game of ancient mysteries and deities? Did he understand that he was not building a tool of war, but a tool of psychological warfare? The hum of the horse, its strange, mesmerizing sound, was his final artistic signature, a signature of divine madness. It was a sound that would soon echo through the very heart of Troy, not as a warning, but as a lullaby. When the Achaean forces finally withdrew, leaving the colossal wooden horse on the beach, the Trojans were gripped by a mixture of shock, relief, and profound suspicion. They had been at war for 10 years. A decade of their lives had been spent behind these high walls, waiting for the inevitable. Now, the enemy had simply vanished. The silence was unnerving. For so long, the constant clang of swords, the roar of battle cries, and the screams of the dying had been the soundtrack of their lives. Now, there was only the sound of the waves and the wind, and the horse. A strange, undeniable hum emanated from the giant wooden beast. It wasn't loud, but it was omnipresent, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in the air. The Trojans came out of their gates cautiously, a few at a time, their shields held high. They approached the horse, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had never seen anything like it. It was a work of impossible craftsmanship, a feat of engineering that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. The wood was smooth, almost polished, and the carvings on its flanks were not of battle scenes or heroes, but of strange, geometric patterns that seemed to shimmer and shift in the sunlight. These weren't mere decorations. They were a bizarre oral code. It was a form of ancient encryption, a set of symbols designed to resonate with the oral hum, creating a psychological effect on anyone who came near it. This strange, silent power was one of the many ancient mysteries of the artifact. A well-known historical fact is that ancient cultures often used intricate symbols and patterns on their sacred objects. These were not just for beauty, but were believed to contain a certain kind of spiritual power or a specific narrative. The bizarre detail here is that the symbols on the Trojan horse were not from any known civilization. They were from a lost, pre-Hellenic people who believed that certain shapes, when combined with specific sounds, could alter a person's consciousness. The Trojan soldiers, hardened and brave, found themselves strangely disarmed by the sight of the horse. The hum was in their bones and the symbols were in their minds. They looked at the horse, and they did not see a threat. They saw a promise. They saw an end. Some of the elders, their hearts still filled with suspicion, urged caution. They pointed out the strangeness of the offering. The Greeks never give gifts, they whispered to one another. This is a trick. But their words seemed to be swallowed by the silent hum, their doubts lost in the strange hypnotic aura of the artifact. The psychological effect of the horse was not to terrify, but to disarm. It was a weapon of pure, unadulterated psychological manipulation, a Trojan horse for the mind. The Trojans began to circle the horse, their suspicions slowly melting into wonder. They reached out to touch its polished flank, a strange electric tingle running through their fingertips. It was cold to the touch, like a statue that had been left in a deep, dark place. This was a bizarre detail. The horse was not warm from the sun, as a normal wooden structure would be. It seemed to absorb the light and the heat, radiating a strange, cold energy. This energy was another part of the ritual, a chilling reminder that this was not a gift of peace, but an instrument of death. But the Trojans, tired and weary, wanted to believe. They wanted to believe that the war was over, wanted to believe that this was a sign of surrender, a tribute to their victory. The question that remained was, would they listen to the lingering doubts in their hearts, or would they surrender to the seductive psychological promise of the wooden beast? The priest Laocoon was a man of the sea and the sun, a devotee of Apollo. He was one of the few Trojans who did not succumb to the horse's strange hypnotic aura. A man of quiet observation, he stood on the beach, his heart filled not with relief, but with a deep and terrible dread. He was a keeper of the ancient rituals, a repository of forgotten knowledge. He knew that the gods did not give gifts. They demanded sacrifices. The silence was not a gift from the gods. It was a trap. Laocoon recognized the oral hum from a ritual he had read about in an ancient text, a bizarre ceremony of sacrifice known only to a few chosen priests. This ritual, a kind of psychological spell, was meant to disorient and confuse the enemy. Laocoon ran towards the horse, his arms flailing, his voice a hoarse cry of warning. "Do not trust the horse, Trojans," he screamed, his voice raw with terror. "I fear the Greeks, even when they bring gifts." He was met with silence, his words swallowed by the great, empty space of the beach. The Trojans, their faces blank with a kind of serene hypnosis, simply stared at him. They were under the spell of the horse, their minds captured by its strange oral power. Laocoon, in his desperation, performed a bizarre ancient ritual he had learned from his father. He took a spear, an ordinary spear, and plunged it into the horse's flank. The spear did not just clatter to the ground, it was met with a strange, echoing groan, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. This groan was the core of the psychological intrigue. It was a sound of protest, of pain. It was the sound of the warriors inside, their voices muffled and distorted. The horse was not just an empty vessel. It was a living thing, a golem of wood and divine energy. The Trojans, hearing the sound, recoiled in shock, their hypnotic trance momentarily broken. A few of them began to whisper among themselves, their fear returning, but the horse's spell was too strong. The hum returned, more insistent than before, and the strange, shimmering symbols on its flank seemed to glow with a strange, otherworldly light. A fascinating local legend in the ancient Troad region speaks of a specific type of spear called a soul piercer. It was believed that these spears, blessed by a deity, could pierce not just a physical body, but the spirit within and reveal its true nature. Laocoon's spear was not a soul piercer, but a simple wooden spear. Yet his action was a symbolic one, a ritualistic challenge to the horse's divine nature. He was asking it to reveal itself, to show its true form. And it did, with a painful groan. But the gods would not allow their game to be so easily disrupted. Laocoon's insight, his fatal understanding of the bizarre ritual, made his sacrifice even more tragic. He knew what he was doing, and he knew what the consequence would be. He was challenging the gods, and they would not stand for it. He was a man with a rare and dangerous knowledge, a man who saw the truth behind the deception. But the question that remained was, what would the gods send to silence him? What price would he pay for his knowledge? And why was his insight, his brave attempt to expose the deception, met not with divine approval, but with divine wrath? The answer was a chilling one. The gods did not want the Trojans to be saved. They wanted them to be broken, to have their faith in their gods shattered, to suffer the ultimate psychological defeat. The silence that followed Laocoon's cry was short-lived. From the tranquil sea, a terrible sight emerged. Two monstrous serpents, their scales glistening like polished obsidian, slithered from the waves. They were not ordinary creatures. They moved with a strange, rhythmic grace, a bizarre dance that was both horrifying and beautiful. Their movements were not random. They were a ritualistic act of divine cleansing. They moved not to attack, but to perform a sacred macabre duty. A strange fact about ancient Greek serpent lore is that snakes were often seen as agents of the divine, messengers of the gods. They could represent healing, but they could also represent destruction and retribution. These serpents were the latter. As they approached the shore, their movements became more synchronized, more ritualistic. They were a bizarre and unsettling sight, their bodies weaving in and out of each other in a hypnotic dance. They were not there to kill, they were there to silence. Their target was not just Laocoon, but his sons as well. The act was a public display, a brutal performance of divine power. It was meant to show the Trojans that their doubts were heretical, that their suspicions were a sin. It was a psychological tool, a way to reassert the horse's sacred nature and to crush any remaining resistance. Laocoon, seeing the serpents, knew his fate. He had seen the oral code in the horse's flank, and he had seen the divine contract that bound the gods. He knew this was the price for his knowledge. As the serpents coiled around him and his sons, their movements were not of brute force, but of a strange, ritualistic embrace. The serpents' mouths were not filled with venom, but with a strange, glowing liquid that seemed to dissolve their flesh, not with violence, but with a kind of oral vibration. A bizarre detail, the serpents did not bite or crush. They hummed. Their bodies vibrated with the same low, resonant thrum as the horse, a bizarre oral echo. They were extensions of the horse's power, instruments of its psychological will. The Trojans watched in a state of horrified fascination. The death of Laocoon was not just a tragedy, it was a performance. It was a macabre ritualistic warning. The serpents, having completed their grim task, slithered away, disappearing into the sacred grove of Apollo. The Trojans were left in a state of terror and awe. The message was clear. The gods were on the side of the horse. The gods wanted the horse brought into the city. The psychological spell had been reinforced. Any lingering doubts were now consumed by a fresh wave of fear and a renewed belief in the horse's divine nature. The Trojans now saw the horse not just as a gift, but as a sacred relic, a tribute to the gods that had saved them. The question that remained was, what kind of deity would demand such a bizarre public sacrifice? And what kind of psychological terror would be unleashed when the silent, sacred hum of the horse was unleashed within the city walls? The Trojans were about to find out that the ritual had just begun. The serpents were a bizarre, beautiful opening act. The main event was yet to come. The oral hum of the horse would soon become the funeral dirge of an entire civilization. The sight of Laocoon's fate was the final devastating blow. The Trojans, their fear momentarily overwhelming them, were now convinced. The horse was a sacred artifact, a gift from the gods. To deny it would be to invite divine wrath. The psychological effect of the serpent's ritual dance was profound. It wasn't just a threat of death, it was a threat to their very faith, their deeply held beliefs about their relationship with the divine. So, they made the fateful decision. They would bring the horse into the city. But this was not a logical choice. It was a moment of mass psychological surrender, guided by unseen forces. The process of bringing the horse into the city was a ritual in itself. It was not a simple matter of pulling a large object. The horse's size and weight were immense, and the city gates were too narrow. The Trojans had to dismantle a part of their wall, the very thing that had protected them for a decade. This was a symbolic act, a moment of profound psychological significance. They were not just opening their city, they were opening their hearts, their minds, and their defenses to the unknown. A fascinating historical fact about city walls is that, in ancient times, they were not just physical barriers, were spiritual ones, were imbued with the spirit of the city's protector gods, and to break them was to break the divine contract. The Trojans worked tirelessly, their spirits buoyed by a sense of purpose. They sang songs of victory, their voices a triumphant cacophony. But beneath the surface, a sense of unease still lingered. The horse seemed to move on its own accord, its massive body gliding almost effortlessly. It was a bizarre detail. The horse seemed to have a will of its own, an almost sentient grace that made the task of moving it feel less like labor and more like a sacred procession. It was as if the horse was a living thing, a golem of wood and divine energy. The oral hum it produced seemed to intensify as it moved closer to the city, the sound a low, triumphant roar that only the Trojans seemed to hear. The horse was a magnet for the Trojans' psychological surrender. It was a physical manifestation of their collective will to believe. They had suffered for so long, they were desperate for an end, any end, and the horse was a promise of one. The idea of a Trojan victory after a decade of brutal warfare was too tempting to resist. The horse was not a sign of the Achaeans' surrender, but a symbol of the Trojans' psychological collapse. The Trojans' decision to bring the horse into their city was a final, desperate act of faith, a leap of hope into the unknown. They wanted to believe that the war was over. They wanted to believe that they had won. But the question that remained was, what price would they pay for their faith? What dark truth lay hidden behind the beautiful silent facade of the wooden beast? And what kind of bizarre ritual would be performed within the city walls once the horse, the Trojans' new god, was finally at rest? The Trojans, in their collective psychological trance, were about to find out that their long nightmare had not ended. It was just beginning. The horse was not a gift of peace. It was a vessel of epic betrayal. As the horse was finally pulled through the breached city walls and into the heart of Troy, a profound and unsettling change fell over the city. A great hush descended. It was not the celebratory silence the Trojans had anticipated, but a stillness so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Inside the temples, a strange phenomenon occurred. All the familiar statues and idols of Troy, the protectors they had worshipped for centuries, seemed to turn away from the horse. Their stone faces, once serene and benevolent, were now grim and averted. This was a subtle but deeply unsettling omen, a chilling sign of betrayal. A lesser-known historical fact is that in ancient times, statues of deities were sometimes believed to be living vessels, their eyes and postures conveying their divine will. Priests would watch for subtle shifts, a change in a statue's expression, a tear of sacred oil, as a sign of divine displeasure or favor. The bizarre detail here is that the idols of Troy did not just turn their heads. Their entire bodies seemed to twist in their pedestals, their gazes. Fixed on the city walls on the gaping wound the Trojans had made to bring the horse inside. It was as if they were weeping for the fate of their people, a silent, terrible warning. The horse was placed in the central square, a place usually reserved for offerings and grand ceremonies. It stood there, a towering colossus, its presence a gravitational pull on the very air itself. The oral hum was now a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to fill the city, vibrating in the very foundations of the buildings. It was a sound that should have been terrifying, but instead, it was soothing. It was a bizarre psychological paradox. The Trojans, exhausted from their decade-long ordeal, found themselves lulled into a state of profound peace. Their weariness was a weakness, a susceptibility the horse's energy was designed to exploit. This phenomenon was a form of mass psychological manipulation. The horse was not just a container for warriors. It was a conduit for a kind of divine energy, a strange, hypnotic resonance that preyed on the human desire for peace and comfort. It was a bizarre psychological weapon designed to lull the Trojans into a false sense of security, to make them forget the dangers they had just faced for 10 years. It was a quiet storm, a silent epic waiting to unfold. The Trojans, in their state of blissful ignorance, began to celebrate. They lit bonfires, they sang songs, they feasted. But the old priests, the few who had not been swayed by the horse's magic, watched in silent horror. They knew what the averted eyes of the gods meant. The question that remained was, what would the horse do now that it was inside the city? What would happen when the last light of the bonfires died down, and the last song was sung? The Trojans were about to discover that the horse was not just a passive object, it was a psychological catalyst, a silent epic, waiting to burst forth. The idols had turned away, but the Trojans, in their blissful ignorance, had turned away from the warnings, and the silence was about to be broken. The divine hand guiding the creation of the Trojan horse was not just the will of Athena, but her most cruel and manipulative expression. Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, was not a simple patron of the Achaeans. She was a master of psychological warfare, a deity who saw conflict not just as a clash of arms, but as a test of wits, of strategy, and of the human mind. Her role in the horse's creation was a bizarre game, a terrible blessing. The horse was a gift from her to the Achaeans, but it was also a test for the Trojans, a challenge to their faith and their hubris. The horse was not just a tool of war. It was a sacred instrument of divine deception. A lesser-known fact about Athena is her obsession with puzzles and intricate riddles. She was known to challenge heroes and mortals alike with complex intellectual tests, and their failure often resulted in a terrible fate. The Trojan horse was her most complex riddle yet. The horse was a visual puzzle, a contradiction in form and function. It was a gift from an enemy, a symbol of peace from a people known for their violence. It was a beautiful thing of wood and art, yet it was a vessel for destruction. The bizarre detail is that Athena did not just design the horse. She imbued it with a part of her own cunning, a psychological aura that would confuse and disarm the Trojans. She gave it a piece of her wisdom, but a piece that was designed to be misunderstood. The Trojans, in their exhaustion, failed the test. They saw the horse as a gift from the gods, a sign of their victory, when it was a sign of their defeat. They saw peace when they should have seen a trap. Athena, in her twisted wisdom, was testing their ability to see past the surface, to understand the true nature of the epic struggle they were engaged in. The Trojans, in their hubris, had angered the gods by not listening to the warnings of the few seers who saw the truth. Athena, in her twisted benevolence, was giving them a chance to prove themselves worthy of their city, but they failed the test. They failed to understand the riddle, and the price for their failure would be the loss of everything. The horse was a symbol of Athena's cold, calculating nature. She was not a goddess of mercy. She was a goddess of strategic advantage. She did not want to save the Trojans. She wanted to show them the limits of their mortal minds, wanted to prove that her wisdom was superior to their courage. The horse was a beautiful, terrible demonstration of her power, a physical manifestation of her psychological brilliance. It was a silent testament to the idea that a mind can be a more powerful weapon than a sword. The question that remained was, what kind of psychological devastation would be unleashed when the silent, sacred hum of the horse was unleashed within the city walls? What would happen when the last of the Trojans' faith was broken? The Trojans, in their collective psychological trance, were about to find out that the horse was not a gift of peace, but an instrument of divine vengeance. The city was not just about to be conquered, it was about to be unmade. The horse was a sacred instrument of divine vengeance, a final terrible act of betrayal. Inside the belly of the Trojan horse, a bizarre and claustrophobic ritual was underway. The Achaean soldiers, led by the cunning Odysseus, were not just waiting. They were performing a strange and terrifying ceremony. They were huddled in the darkness, their swords sheathed, their armor silent. They were not allowed to speak, not allowed to move. Their task was to remain still, to become one with the horse, to absorb its strange oral energy. A lesser-known fact about ancient Greek soldiers is that they often performed pre-battle rituals to psychologically prepare themselves for combat. These were not just prayers for victory. They were ceremonies of self-emptying, of becoming a vessel for the will of the gods. The bizarre detail here is that the ritual inside the horse was not a prayer for victory, but an act of psychological surrender. The soldiers were not becoming more human. They were becoming less so. They were shedding their identities, their fears, their doubts. They were becoming a part of the horse, a living, breathing component of the great wooden beast. They were absorbing the oral hum that emanated from the wood, and the sound was changing them. It was dulling their senses, numbing their minds, and sharpening their focus. They were becoming machines of war, instruments of divine will. Odysseus, the master of deception, understood that the real battle was not with the Trojans, but with their own psychological state. They had to become invisible, not just to the Trojans, but to the gods themselves. The ritual was simple, yet profoundly unsettling. The soldiers would press their hands against the horse's inner walls, absorbing the cold, strange energy. They would close their eyes and listen to the hum, letting it fill their minds. They would feel their own thoughts, their own fears, melting away, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. It was a kind of psychological alchemy, a bizarre process of self-transformation. The horse was their crucible. The oral hum was the fire that was forging them into something new, something terrifying. They were not just warriors, they were ghosts. They were specters, waiting to emerge from a hollow womb. The question that remained was, what kind of men would emerge from the horse? Would they be the heroes the Trojans knew, or something else. Something darker, something more ancient and terrifying. The ritual was a psychological unmaking, a process that would leave them forever changed. They were entering the horse as men, but they would emerge as something else entirely. The Trojan horse was not just a container for heroes. It was a psychological womb, a place of terrible transformation. The heroes who entered the horse were about to be reborn as something else, something far more sinister. The ritual had just begun. As the Trojans celebrated, their minds surrendered to the horse's alluring hum. A strange and unnatural sleep began to creep over the city. It was not a physical exhaustion, but a collective psychological collapse induced by a forgotten deity. This was a supernatural phenomenon, a grand illusion designed to make the final act of betrayal even more devastating. The Trojans, their bodies weary from celebration and their minds tired from years of war, were ripe for this kind of psychological attack. A fascinating historical fact is that in ancient medical texts, there are references to a condition called divine slumber, where entire populations would fall into a deep, unshakable sleep, believed to be the work of a god. The bizarre detail here is that this was not a sleep of rest, but a sleep of terror. The goddess responsible was not a great or famous deity, but a forgotten being of ancient legends, the goddess of silence and stillness, whose name has been deliberately erased from the epic poems. She was a silent partner in Athena's grand deception, a master of psychological manipulation. Her symbol was a single, unbroken thread of black silk, and her power was the ability to silence the human mind, to weave a kind of psychological web of dreams and illusions. She did not put the Trojans to sleep with a magical spell. She simply amplified the horse's oral hum until it became a deep, irresistible wave of psychological exhaustion. The hum was not just a sound, it was a lullaby of betrayal, a lullaby that whispered of peace and safety, while it lulled them into a state of utter vulnerability. The citizens of Troy collapsed where they stood, a man holding a cup of wine at a feast, a mother rocking her child to sleep, a guard standing on a deserted watchtower. All of them, without warning, fell into a deep, death-like slumber. The city went silent. The crackling bonfires still burned, but there was no one left to tend to them. The streets were empty, save for the sleeping bodies. The city was a ghost town, a silent, surreal stage for the final act of betrayal. This was the second ritual, the sleep of 1,000 fears. The Trojans, in their state of unconsciousness, were not dreaming of peace. They were dreaming of their worst fears, were trapped in a psychological nightmare, a premonition of the terror that was about to be unleashed. The question that remained was, what would the heroes inside the horse do now that the city was a psychological tomb? And what would happen when the sleeping citizens finally awoke to the reality of their defeat? The silence was about to be broken, not by the clamor of war, but by the screams of a city betrayed. The oral hum had done its job. It had turned a city of heroes into a city of sleeping lambs. The final terrible act of betrayal was just moments away. In the deep, unnerving silence of the city, a single, chilling voice began to whisper. It was not the voice of a man, or a woman, or a god. It was a disembodied whisper, a strange echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a bizarre oral phenomenon, a bizarre detail of the Trojan horse's true power. The voice was a psychological lure, a final, insidious piece of the deception. It was not a call to war, but a promise of peace, a promise of a new beginning. The voice began to whisper to certain Trojans, a select few whose minds were most susceptible to its power. These were not the leaders or the heroes, but the ordinary citizens who had suffered the most, whose faith was most fragile. The whisper was a bizarre, psychological siren's call, a promise of a final, quiet end to their suffering. It urged them towards the horse, not with a command, but with a seductive, gentle suggestion. It told them that the horse was a sacred altar, a place where they could finally find peace. It told them that all they had to do was approach it, and their long nightmare would be over. A fascinating local legend, a bizarre detail of ancient Greek mythology, is the idea of a daemonion, a personal, guiding spirit that could either lead a person to greatness or to their doom. The voice from the horse was a kind of dark daemonion, a demonic spirit that was feeding on the Trojans' desperation. It was a psychological parasite, a voice that mimicked their own inner thoughts, their own secret desires. It was not just a whisper. It was a conversation, a subtle, psychological manipulation that made the Trojans feel as if they were making their own choice. They were not being forced. They were being led. Some of the Trojans, a few brave souls who had not fallen into the deep slumber, heard the voice and were drawn to the horse. They approached it, their faces blank, with a kind of serene hypnosis. They did not see the hidden ramp, the door at the horse's side. They saw a symbol of their victory, a final resting place for their hopes and dreams. They were so close to the truth, yet so far away. The voice was a cruel, brilliant trick, a final act of psychological betrayal. It was leading the Trojans to their doom, but it was making them believe they were walking towards a new dawn. The question that remained was, what would happen when the Achaean heroes finally emerged from the horse? Would they be met with resistance, or would they be met with a city of sleeping victims? The voice was a psychological alarm clock, a silent wake-up call for the coming storm. The Trojans were about to discover that the horse was not a god of peace, but a god of death, and its voice was a prelude to the city's final song. The Trojans, who approached the horse in their hypnotic trance, saw nothing but a magnificent work of art. But if they had looked closer, if their minds had not been so clouded by the oral hum, they would have seen the subtle, hidden symbols of betrayal carved into the horse's wood. These weren't just random etchings. They were arcane runes, a bizarre detail of the horse's true nature. They were not of Greek or Trojan origin, but from a lost language of a long-vanished people. A tribe of seers and priests who believed that symbols had the power to confuse and disorient the mind. A quirky historical fact is that many ancient civilizations believed in the power of a curse symbol or a blessing symbol. These were not just for show, but were believed to have a specific kind of spiritual power. The runes on the horse were a kind of curse, a form of oral magic that was designed to break down the mind's defenses. The symbols were carved in a way that they would resonate with the horse's oral hum, creating a subtle psychological dissonance. The Trojans would look at the symbols and their minds would be filled with a strange, tantalizing feeling of familiarity and unease. They would feel as if they had seen the symbols before, but they couldn't remember where. This was a deliberate act of psychological disorientation, a way to make them doubt their own perceptions. The runes were a bizarre form of psychological warfare. They were not meant to be read, but to be felt. They were a visual manifestation of the oral hum, a kind of psychological feedback loop. The more the Trojans looked at the symbols, the more they were hypnotized by the hum. The symbols were a bizarre form of divine graffiti, a cruel joke played by Athena and the other gods who had conspired to bring about Troy's downfall. They were a message to the mortals, a message that said, "We are right here, hidden in plain sight, and you are too blind to see us." The question that remained was, would any of the Trojans in their final moments see the truth behind the symbols? Would they understand the epic betrayal that was about to unfold? The runes were a silent testament to the gods' cruelty, a final, chilling observation on the nature of gods and mortals. The Trojans, in their blissful ignorance, were about to pay the ultimate price for their lack of vision. The symbols were not just a clue, they were a death warrant. The city's renowned seer Cassandra was a woman cursed by Apollo to speak the truth, but never to be believed. While the rest of Troy celebrated and then succumbed to the unnatural slumber, she remained awake, her mind a fortress of prophecy and despair. This was a bizarre psychological phenomenon. Her curse had rendered her immune to the horse's hypnotic hum. It was as if her mind, so used to the constant dissonance of seeing truth and being disbelieved, was fortified against this new form of psychological assault. Cassandra did not just see the future. She saw the past, present, and future all at once. She saw the horse, and she saw the truth behind its beautiful facade. A fascinating fact from ancient Greek mythology is that the curse of a deity could also be a form of protection. Apollo's curse on Cassandra, while a source of her torment, also made her an unassailable bastion of truth. Her mind, so used to the constant conflict between what she knew and what others believed, was a psychological paradox. She was the one person in Troy who was truly free, yet she was also a prisoner of her own knowledge. As she watched the horse being pulled into the city, she fell into a deep, ritualistic trance. She saw not just the Achaean soldiers hidden inside, but the bizarre, supernatural history of the horse itself. She saw the obscure deity who created the oral hum, the seers who had designed the arcane runes. She saw the god of forgotten dreams who had induced the citywide slumber. Her trance was a psychological journey, a descent into the deepest, darkest parts of the myth. She saw the horse not as a single artifact, but as a living, breathing epic of betrayal, compilation of all the ancient mysteries and deities that had conspired against Troy. In her trance, she saw a bizarre detail. The horse had a soul. It was a golem, a living vessel, and its soul was a twisted, cruel parody of a human one. It was a collection of all the Achaean soldiers' rage, their cunning, and their malice. It was a living embodiment of the war, a physical manifestation of a psychological disease. Cassandra saw the horse's soul, and she saw her own fate tied to its destiny. She knew she could not stop the inevitable, but she could bear witness to it. She would be the last person to truly understand the epic tragedy of Troy. The question that remained was, what would happen when she finally emerged from her trance? Would she be able to warn her people, or would she be too late? The horse was a grand theatrical stage, and Cassandra was the last person in the audience. Her vision was the final, terrible piece of the puzzle, the one last truth that no one would believe. The Achaean heroes, now fully transformed by their bizarre ritual, began to emerge from the horse's hollow womb. They were not just men, they were silent, efficient instruments of destruction. The process was not a violent, chaotic assault, but a strange, systematic unmaking of the city's defenses. It was a ritual, a ceremonial dismantling of Troy's faith in its physical form. A fascinating fact about ancient warfare is that certain battles were seen as spiritual acts, not just physical ones. Soldiers would perform specific rituals, like taking a single stone from a conquered city's wall, to symbolize the spiritual victory over the enemy. The Achaeans took this a step further. Odysseus, the master of this grand deception, led the heroes out of the horse and into the silent streets. They did not shout or scream. They moved with a chilling, preternatural silence, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The city's gates, which had been broken to let the horse in, were now fully opened. The guards in their deep slumber were quietly and ceremoniously disarmed. Their shields and swords were not taken as spoils of war. They were laid out on the ground in a specific, ritualistic pattern, a symbolic gesture of the city's psychological defeat. This was a bizarre detail. The Achaeans were not just conquering a city. They were performing a victory ceremony, an unmaking of the city's spiritual defenses. The city walls, so long a source of pride and protection, were not just torn down. They were systematically and ritually dismantled. Each stone was removed with a certain reverence, as if the Achaeans were not breaking down a wall, but performing a sacred rite. The oral hum of the horse, now a deep resonant roar, filled the city. It was a triumphant song of unmaking, a bizarre oral accompaniment to the dismantling of Troy. The horse was no longer just a container. It was the city's master, its silent ruler. The heroes, now its instruments, were simply carrying out its will. The question that remained was, what would the Trojans do when they awoke to find their city not just conquered, but ritually unmade? And what would happen to their faith, now that the very stones of their city had betrayed them? The ritual of the unmaking of Troy was a terrible psychological defeat. The Achaean heroes were not just taking a city, they were taking a soul. As the Achaean heroes moved through the silent, sleeping city, a strange and unsettling phenomenon began to occur. A low, mournful whisper, a chilling echo from the underworld, rose from the ground near the horse. It was the faint, ghostly cries of forgotten heroes from a previous failed war. A conflict so ancient its memory had been erased from the annals of time. This was a bizarre detail, a terrifying oral haunting. The horse was not just a symbol of the present war, it was a conduit to a previous, forgotten conflict. A fascinating fact from ancient Greek folklore is the belief in Nicaea, a ritual where a hero would descend into the underworld to commune with the spirits of the dead. The horse was a kind of reverse Nicaea. The spirits of the dead were not being called upon. They were being released. The horse, with its bizarre oral magic, was opening a portal to the underworld, a temporary tear in the fabric of reality. The ghosts were not malevolent. They were simply lost, their voices a mournful chorus of despair and regret. They were a ghostly reminder that the fall of Troy was not an isolated event, but a part of a much larger, cosmic struggle between the gods and mortals. The oral hum of the horse was a bizarre frequency, a sound that resonated with the very essence of the underworld. It was a kind of spiritual siren's call, a sound that drew the ghosts of the past to the present. The Achaean heroes, now numb to the psychological and spiritual auras of the horse, did not hear the whispers. But Cassandra, still in her prophetic trance, heard them all. She heard the faint cries of the dead, and she knew that the fall of Troy was not just a tragedy, but a cosmic event. It was a part of a larger, epic cycle of destruction and despair. The question that remained was, would the living be able to learn from the ghosts of the past? Would they be doomed to repeat the same mistakes? The horse was a living library of ancient mysteries and deities, a repository of forgotten knowledge. And its whispers were a terrifying warning that the city's fate was not in the hands of men, but in the hands of the gods and in the hands of the forgotten dead. The ritual of the horse had just opened a new door, a door to the city's past and to its terrifying inevitable future. Before the final assault, a bizarre and chilling ritual took place at the horse's base. It was a bloodless offering, a ceremony performed by the Achaean commanders, led by Odysseus. This was not a sacrifice to the gods for victory. It was a psychological offering, a symbolic act of power and control. A lesser-known fact about some ancient rituals is the concept of a sympathetic offering, where a symbolic act could be a powerful spiritual weapon. The Achaean commanders were performing a sympathetic offering to the gods of Troy, not to appease them, but to humiliate them. The bizarre detail here is the offering itself. The commanders did not offer gold or food or wine. They offered something far more precious, a single, black feather from the wing of a raven and a handful of the city's sacred earth. The raven was a bird of death and ill omen, and its feather was a symbol of the coming destruction. The sacred earth was a bizarre psychological weapon. The Trojans believed that the earth of their city was imbued with the spirit of their ancestors, and to take it was to take a part of their soul. The Achaean commanders were performing a ritualistic act of theft, a symbolic act of spiritual conquest. They were not just taking the city, they were taking its very essence. The commanders stood around the horse, their faces grim, their voices low and reverent. They laid the offerings on a flat stone, a kind of makeshift altar. The oral hum of the horse intensified, a deep, resonant roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. The horse was a witness to this bizarre ceremony, a silent accomplice. It was a psychological war of attrition, a battle not for the city's walls, but for its soul. The Achaean commanders were not just fighting a war, they were performing a ritual of profound disrespect and profound power. The question that remained was, would the gods of Troy, in their long, silent slumber, feel the insult? Would they wake up in time to save their city, or would they remain in their state of blissful ignorance? The ritual of the bloodless offering was the final, devastating act of psychological warfare. It was a symbolic act of triumph, a final message to the Trojans that their gods had abandoned them, and that their city was already lost. The horse was not just a container for heroes, it was a sacred altar of betrayal. The final, terrible act of the ritual was the fall of the city walls. It was not a physical act of brute force, but a supernatural resonance, a wave of energy from the horse. The Achaean heroes, now fully emerged from their hollow womb, did not need to use brute force. The horse, their silent master, did it for them. The oral hum, which had lulled the Trojans into a deep sleep and had psychologically disarmed them, now became a weapon of pure, unadulterated destruction. A quirky fact of ancient architectural mythology is the idea of a singing stone. It was believed that some stones, when struck at a certain frequency, could produce a sound that would cause a structure to collapse. The horse's oral hum was a kind of singing stone on a cosmic scale. The hum was a specific frequency, a bizarre detail of the horse's design that resonated with the very stones of the city walls. The sound was not loud or violent, but a deep, pervasive vibration that seemed to unravel the very essence of the stone. The walls did not crumble or fall with a great crash. They simply began to dissolve, the stones turning to dust, the mortar crumbling into sand. It was a silent, terrifying spectacle. The Trojans, in their deep slumber, did not hear the sound, but they felt the vibration. They felt their city, their home, their very foundation, dissolving beneath them. It was a psychological horror, a waking nightmare. They were not being conquered by a foreign army. They were being consumed by their own trust, their own faith. The horse was not a god of victory. It was a god of unmaking. The question that remained was, what would the Trojans do when they awoke to find their city defenseless? Would they fight, or would they surrender to the psychological terror of their defeat? The horse was a master of psychological warfare, and its final act was a masterpiece of silent, terrible power. The city was not just about to be conquered. It was about to be psychologically shattered. The fall of the city walls was the final, devastating act of a grand and terrible ceremony, a ritual of destruction and despair. The horse's bizarre ritual was not just an act of conquest, but an unmaking of the city's spiritual defenses. This was most evident in the fate of Troy's forgotten protector god. Unbeknownst to the Trojans, their city had an ancient forgotten protector, a minor deity of the hearth and home whose name and worship had faded over centuries. This god's existence was a bizarre detail, a secret held in the very foundation of the city. Its long-dormant curse was about to activate, turning the very stones against its people. A fascinating local legend in the ancient Troad region speaks of a deity who was a guardian of ancient mysteries and deities. The god's symbol was a single, silent flame that burned in the city's heart, a flame that represented the city's unbreakable spirit. When the Trojans, in their hubris, had chosen to trust the horse and break their walls, they had unknowingly extinguished this flame. The horse's oral hum was not just a sound, it was a spiritual anti-siren's call, a sound that was the complete opposite of the protector god's silent flame. The hum was a sound of chaos and discord. It's a sound that was designed to break the spiritual contract between the city and its forgotten protector. The curse was not a violent one. It was a curse of confusion and disorientation. When the Achaean heroes finally emerged from the horse, the few Trojans who were not in a deep slumber found themselves unable to fight. Their swords felt heavy, their shields felt like lead. They were not physically weakened, they were spiritually and psychologically disarmed. The city itself, in its final moments of agony, was fighting them. The stones beneath their feet seemed to shift, the walls around them seemed to twist and turn. They were lost in their own city, in a labyrinth of their own making. The forgotten protector god, in its silent rage, had turned the city into a psychological weapon against its own people. The question that remained was, why had the god remained silent for so long? Why had its curse only activated in the city's final moments? The answer was a chilling one. The god was not just a protector, it was a witness. It had been watching the Trojans' hubris for a decade, their slow descent into despair and self-deception. It had been waiting for the perfect moment to deliver its final, terrible judgment. The curse was not a punishment for a single act, but for a decade of self-betrayal. The Trojans had betrayed themselves, and their city, in its final moments, was mirroring their betrayal. But the horse was not just a container for heroes. It was a sacred instrument of divine vengeance. The great hero Hector, though dead, was still a part of the city. His spirit, tethered to Troy by his profound love for his people, tried to perform a final ritual to save it. A lesser-known fact about some ancient heroes is the belief that their spirits could linger after death, acting as spiritual protectors or as vengeful ghosts. Hector was the former. His spirit was a powerful force, a guardian of the city's soul. He felt the horse's strange oral hum, and he felt the unmaking of his city. He was a hero even in death.
You're not, you're silent. Yeah.
His final ritual was a silent one, a prayer of the heart, a ceremony of will. He tried to project his spiritual energy into the minds of the sleeping Trojans, to break them out of their slumber, to warn them of the impending doom. He tried to reach out to the gods of Troy, to beg them for a final act of mercy. But his efforts were thwarted by the horse's dark aura. The horse was a spiritual anti-god, a bizarre artifact that was designed to silence the will of mortals and to mock the power of the divine. Its oral hum was a kind of spiritual static, a bizarre detail of its power that was designed to drown out the voice of the dead and the prayers of the living. Hector's spirit, in its final moments of agony, saw the truth. He saw the Achaean heroes emerging from the horse, and he saw them not as men, but as gods of destruction. He saw the Trojans, his people, in their deep slumber, their faces serene with a peace they had not earned. He saw the city, his city, being unmade, not by force, but by a psychological surrender. He was a hero in death, but his heroism was not enough to save his people. The horse was a power far greater than any mortal, living or dead. It was a bizarre living monument to the gods' cruelty and the mortals' hubris. The question that remained was, what would the Trojans do when they awoke to find their hero's spirit had failed them? Would their faith be shattered, or would they find a new hero, a new source of hope? The horse was a master of psychological warfare, and its final act was a masterpiece of silent, terrible power. The city was not just about to be conquered. It was about to be psychologically shattered. The fall of the city walls was the final, devastating act of a grand and terrible ceremony, a ritual of destruction and despair. As the Achaean heroes emerged from the hollow womb of the horse, a bizarre truth was revealed. They were not the only occupants. The horse held something far more ancient and terrifying. This was a bizarre detail, an untold truth behind the grand deception. The horse was not just a clever trick, it was a vessel for something else, something that had been waiting for centuries to be released. It was a bizarre oral ghost, a formless entity that had been trapped inside a primordial sphere and had been a silent accomplice in the gods' cruel game. A fascinating local legend is the tale of the Cares, a race of female death spirits in Greek mythology, often associated with violent death. The horse was carrying a single, powerful cur, a primordial spirit of destruction, that had been bound to the oral hum of the horse. The cur was a bizarre detail, a terrifying, psychological predator. It did not have a physical form. It was a formless entity of pure, unadulterated terror. It was not a violent spirit. It was a spirit of psychological warfare. Its purpose was to feed on the fear and despair of the Trojans, to make their defeat even more profound and more devastating. The cur was a silent accomplice in the gods' grand deception. It was the source of the horse's bizarre oral hum. It was the voice that had whispered to the Trojans, urging them towards their doom. It was the presence that had made the idols turn away. It was a living, breathing epic of betrayal. A compilation of all the ancient mysteries and deities that had conspired against Troy. The Achaean heroes were not the masters of the horse. They were just its instruments. The horse, and the spirit within it, was the true weapon. The question that remained was, what would the cur do now that it was released? Would it continue to feed on the fear of the Trojans, or would it move on to a new host, a new victim? The horse was a beautiful, terrible demonstration of the gods' power, a physical manifestation of their psychological brilliance. The Trojan horse was not just a container for heroes. It was a sacred instrument of divine vengeance, a final, terrible act of betrayal. A strange, unearthly silence fell over the city just before the final, brutal assault. It was not the natural silence of a sleeping city, but a profound, almost spiritual stillness. The bonfires had died down, the hum of the horse had ceased, and the whispers from the underworld had fallen quiet. It was a moment of profound psychological terror, the calm before the storm. It was a bizarre detail, a final act of the horse's ritualistic power. The horse was not just a container for heroes. It was a master of psychological manipulation, a master of oral storytelling. The silence was a weapon, a final, chilling observation on the nature of gods and mortals. The gods, in their cruel amusement, were giving the Trojans one final moment of peace, one final moment of blissful ignorance before their world was shattered. It was a psychological paradox, a beautiful moment of stillness that was a prelude to the most terrible act of violence. The Trojans, in their deep slumber, were not dreaming of peace. They were dreaming of a future they would never have, a future of family and home and prosperity. It was a cruel trick, a beautiful illusion that was designed to make the final, brutal act of betrayal even more devastating. The question that remained was, what would the Trojans do when they awoke to a world of silence? Would they be able to comprehend the magnitude of their loss? Or would their minds be shattered by the psychological trauma? The silence was a psychological void, a place of terrible emptiness. The Trojans were about to discover that the horse was not a god of peace, but a god of death, and its silence was a prelude to the city's final song. The Achaean victory was less a conquest and more a psychological unmaking. a moment where the very faith of the Trojans was ceremonially broken. The heroes, having emerged from the horse, did not just kill. They performed a ritual of shattering. The city, which had been a fortress of faith and hope for a decade, was now a hollow shell. The Trojans, in their final moments, did not just die. They were unmade. A fascinating local legend, a bizarre detail of ancient warfare, is the concept of a soul-taking. It was believed that in certain battles, a conquering army would not just take the lives of their enemies, but their very souls, their faith, their hope. The Achaean heroes were performing a kind of soul-taking. They were not just killing the Trojans. They were ceremonially breaking their will, their hope, their faith. The act was a psychological one, a final, devastating act of betrayal. The Trojans, who had placed their faith in their gods, their heroes and their city, were now faced with the devastating reality that all of it was an illusion. The horse was a beautiful, terrible demonstration of the gods' power, a physical manifestation of their psychological brilliance. The question that remained was, what would a city without a soul be? Would it be a ghost town, a place of despair, a monument to a lost civilization? The Trojans, in their final moments, were about to discover that the horse was not a god of peace, but a god of death, and its victory was not a conquest, but a ceremony of unmaking. The city was not just about to be conquered, it was about to be psychologically shattered. After the city's fall, a new, bizarre deity was born from the chaos and despair. An entity tied directly to the horse's strange rituals. This was a bizarre detail, an untold truth of the Trojan War. The war was not just a battle between men. It was a breeding ground for new gods, new powers, new epic mysteries. The horse, with its strange oral magic and its powerful psychological aura, was a kind of spiritual crucible. It had consumed the faith of the Trojans, the rage of the Achaean heroes, and the despair of a forgotten deity. And from this bizarre psychological alchemy, a new god was born. The new deity was not a god of war, or of wisdom, or of the sea. It was a god of betrayal, a god of psychological warfare, a god of epic lies. Its symbol was a single black horse, a ghost of the past, a silent promise of future betrayals. The god was not a malevolent being, but a quiet, sidious presence that would linger in the shadows of history, silent epic that would continue to unfold long after the war was over. It was a testament to the power of a lie, to the power of a psychological illusion. The question that remained was, what would the new god do? Would it continue to feed on the despair of mortals, or would it find a new home, a new city, a new victim? The horse was a master of psychological warfare, and its final act was a masterpiece of silent, terrible power. The city was not just about to be conquered. It was about to be psychologically shattered. The fall of the city walls was the final, devastating act of a grand and terrible ceremony, a ritual of destruction and despair. The horse was not just a container for heroes. It was a sacred instrument of divine vengeance. The ghost of the epic tale of the Trojan horse lingered long after the war had ended, a silent epic that would continue to haunt future generations. The horse was a scar on the face of history, a psychological wound that would never fully heal. The bizarre rituals of the horse had not just destroyed a city, they had fundamentally altered the human psyche. The Trojans were a lesson in the fragility of faith and the danger of a beautiful lie. Their tale was a terrifying reminder that the greatest battles are not fought with swords and shields, but with the mind. The horse was a ghost that would linger in the shadows of future legends, a silent promise of future betrayals. The story of the Trojan horse would be told and retold for centuries, but the true story, the story of the bizarre rituals and the untold truths, would be lost to time. It would become a simple tale of a wooden horse and a clever trick, a testament to the human desire to believe in a simple, straightforward narrative. Even when the truth is far more complex and terrifying, the last of the Trojans, the few who had survived, were a different people. They were not just conquered, they were psychologically shattered. Their faith in their gods was gone, their faith in their city was gone, and their faith in themselves was gone. They were ghosts, haunting the ruins of a city that had betrayed them. The horse was a master of psychological warfare, and its final act was a masterpiece of silent, terrible power. And now, as we close this chapter, take a moment to consider the epic tale that has just unfolded. We have seen how the gods, in their cruel amusement, used the Trojan horse not just as a tool of war, but as a bizarre instrument of psychological unmaking. We have seen how a simple wooden horse became a sacred altar, a vessel for a bizarre ritual of betrayal and destruction. We have seen how a city, in its final moments of desperation, was consumed not by fire, but by a beautiful, terrible lie. The tale of the Trojan horse is not just a story of heroes and gods. It is a story of us, of our hopes, our fears, and our deep-seated desire to believe in the best, even when faced with the worst. It is a terrifying, chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest enemy is not the one outside the walls, but the one we let in. The horse was not just a container for heroes. It was a sacred instrument of divine vengeance, a final, terrible act of betrayal. The bonfires have faded to embers. The oral hum of the horse, once a roar, is now a faint echo on the wind. The whispers from the underworld have fallen silent. The city of Troy is no more. All that remains is the sound of the waves, a gentle lapping on the shore. The story has ended, but the echoes will linger. The ghost of the epic tale, the memory of the bizarre rituals, will continue to haunt us, a silent reminder of the power of a lie and the fragility of faith. Rest now, and let the truth sink in.